Right then, welcome back. Today, I want to talk on a bit of a topic that a lot of people are discussing. It's a lot of noise in both the industry and outside of the industry, and that's all to do with EVs. So, without further ado, let's jump straight into it, and I'll cover a couple of the points of which this video will cover. Unless you've been sleeping under a rock, there's been quite a lot of stuff in the news to do with EVs, both within the UK and also both very also monumentally within the EU. I also want to talk about us as a business, about do we sell EVs, do we not sell EVs? And I also want to touch on something that will be a little bit of consumer insight to you, I guess, in terms of why I believe actually ownership of an EV isn't actually cost effective, right? I actually genuinely believe ownership of an EV is more expensive than the ICE or combustion engine. So the first one let's talk about then is the elephant in the room, and that was the autumn budget. Now, Rachel from accounts very kindly did a budget for us in autumn. A lot of stuff was covered within the budget, and a lot of it actually was specific towards our industry to do with EVs and hybrid cars. So let's touch on those as we speak then. So in the budget, Rach mentioned that there's going to be some big changes, drastic changes actually, towards EV ownership and hybrid ownership. There was a lot of talk about this actually about 6 to 8 months ago, and it seems to know that noise actually has filtered down and been transparent to a big change up. Now, this actually won't come into force until April 2028 in transparency, but what are they looking to do? So they are looking to do an implementation of a pay per mile. So if you own a full EV, it's 3p a mile driven. If you own a hybrid, it's 1.5. Now, I actually feel a bit bad for hybrid owners because they get stung twice. They get stung for the EV tax, if you like, and then they have to pay the more traditional fuel tax duty. Now, just to quickly highlight and touch on the fuel tax duty, this is something that I posed a lot of questions to people in the industry before, and no one actually really had considered this as a general problem or also had a solution to this question or concern of mine. And yearly, the government make between 24 to 26 billion a year in fuel tax duty, right? That's how much revenue the government generate from taxing fuel. So for what you pay at the pump, 46% of that goes towards the government to spend on a load of rubbish at this point, but to waste basically. So if we just snapped our fingers, right, and overnight we went EV, where on earth are we finding 24 to 26 billion? Because we already barely managed to meet the fiscal rules in the budget in autumn anyway. That was a complete mess. So what, we're just going to add another 20 billion into the black hole, are we? Where does that money come from? Now, what I haven't done and what I can't really ascertain is how much the pay per mile will generate in revenue to offset the difference against fuel tax duty. I imagine there's still a lot of deficit there to manage. So the next conversation could be, obviously that money is not free. The government need that money. They'll find it from somewhere. Will that then incur a raise of electricity costs in terms of, will they implement higher taxes or to try and raise more, to generate more revenue out of the electricity companies, electricity providers, that would then in turn increase the cost of electricity? I mean, the energy price cap already increased as part of the budget, so whether that's something going forward to try and help again meet the deficit of the change, if you like, that's something that needs to be factored into. Obviously, that's a big reason as to why I think they did implement the pay per mile. I really don't think that's going to touch the surface for the cost that they generate from the fuel tax duty, in truth. That will be aligned with inflation, so that 3% and 1.5% respectively will increase with inflation. Obviously, by 2028, that would have inflated anyway, so God knows what that figure will be. But obviously, that's a massive difference to ownership, and I think a lot of people are factoring that into ownership costs because that's something new that was a nice perk, if you like, of owning an EV, was you didn't have to pay any fuel tax duty. You just had to pay what it cost at the charger, which I will get onto about charging costs as well, because there's a couple of shocking things there as well. And from 2026 January, you will not be allowed to drive your EV or hybrid car into a congestion zone for free. So Mr. Khan has decided that no good, you're giving me some more money. Now, all of those will actually have big influences on people that own EVs in and around London anyway. I'm sure that congestion charge would be a big conversation point anyway. Yes, they get a discount on the congestion charge against the normal ICE engine, but they're still paying a large proportion of money towards the congestion zone. So I'm sure that will have a big consideration to ownership, on whether we'll see very similar what happened with diesels when they implemented that with diesel. I know for a fact I saw a huge amount of diesels influx into the market because none of them met the clean air zone or the ULEZ zones, and that had a massive detriment to the values of diesels because everyone's trying to offload diesels, and obviously the supply and demand were like that. People were selling, people didn't want to buy, so that had a big influence to the cost of diesels when they implemented that a couple of years ago. I saw that first and foremost with the buying sites within the business. So that's a really big change, obviously, from the budget. Let's talk about a little bit outside of the UK in recent news. This has only been news for about a week or so now. The EU have backtracked actually on the mandate. So their actual mandate was 2035. Ours was obviously a bit closer than that. So the mandate was 100% of cars from 2035 onwards needed to be fully EV. They've now reduced that to 90%. I wouldn't be surprised to see in years to come that to be reduced again and again and again. Now, why have the EU backtracked on that? Well, the first one's low demand. The demand from the consumer end doesn't match the mandate demand. So they're producing more EV cars than there's demand for. That's not a surprise. That's very common knowledge, right? And also to help compete with Chinese cars. So this is something I want to talk about as well that we'll jump on now in terms of cost of ownership, right? So in 2020, a cost of ownership for EV new is about 50% more. Year to date now is about 22%, right? So it's halved, it's drastically halved. But a big consideration for that is the Chinese market has evolved and blown up, right? So BYD, JQ, all of these other big Chinese companies. I'll be honest, I'll be driving down the road and there'll be one I've just never even heard of before. And they're cheap, right? These EV cars are cheap and they completely smash anything else out the water. Any of the Japanese EVs, Korean EVs, or the German EVs, comparatively, just to give you an example, I did some comparisons on what the cost of a new GLC petrol, both base was. The petrol GLC was 50,995. And if you wanted a comparative EV, it was 60,350, I think it was. So there's a big difference there. It was 9 and a bit grand difference between an ICE and an EV. Obviously, that's a significant amount of money. So you're still going to pay through the nose to get a new EV. So let me talk about that as well at the moment, because we're onto that as a point of topic. So a lot of people switch to EVs because they were under the false illusion or the impression that financially you'd be better off because of the running costs, right? That was one of the big main features for people to move from internal combustion to EV, was because of your running costs. Well, categorically, your running costs are more expensive on an EV, right? Let me break it down for you. There's 3 things that you need to factor into when you look at your running costs. Yes, if you solely based it on petrol and at home charging, you're cheaper at home charging, right? But that's only one very, very minuscule cog within the bigger wheel of stuff that you need to factor into for cost of ownership, for true cost of ownership, right? So we touched on the cost difference as well. So we're about 22% more expensive to buy an EV. If you took Chinese cars out of there, I really still think you'd be 30% more. But let's just say 22% is that's the true figure. So let's run off that. So you're going to pay more money through the nose to own the car, right? That's a given. That's a proven knowledge. That is common knowledge. Let's talk about charging then, because we flirted around the idea earlier. So yes, if you can charge at home, it costs you 5 to 8 pence a mile, right? That's the cost. Not everyone has that luxury to charge at home. Now, because the energy price cap increased, and because people that have to use the rapid charges right? If you're working and you need to charge your car between site visits or you're traveling and commuting, you're actually financially worse off using a rapid charger in 2025 than you are with filling your car up with petrol, right? It's 15 to 23p a mile. And and petrol is about 15 to 17 pence a mile, right? That's the true statistics. So if you haven't got the luxury of a home charger and you have to use a rapid charger because you're out and about, financially you're worse off or no better off, best case, right? So it's going to cost you the same, best case, to run an EV as it is a petrol car for that journey, right? Let's then talk about insurance, because this is something that I did a bit of a question around the business and people were miles off. On average, it costs 25.5% more to insure an EV than it does an internal combustion engine car. Those are the statistics. Now, I looked a little bit I did a bit further depth of investigation into this. Now, I looked at Warranty Solutions Group because they did a very interesting report. So Warranty Solutions Group, one of the biggest warranty companies within the motor trade, they did their own in-depth analysis based on their own warranty claims. And they found that on average, warranty claims for EV cars were between 30 to 50% more expensive than the traditional combustion engine cars. So your cost of ownership if something goes wrong is 30 to 50% more than internal combustion engine, right? So that then obviously has a big influence on insurance costs. Is the reason why insurance costs are so much more, right? So that's a big feature that you have to factor into consideration of ownership, because yes, some people are going to buy a car and it's not going to go wrong, but we don't always have that luxury, right? So that's a big influencing factor, that people need to consider. So if you run the rapid charger, it's no more expensive to run than petrol. It costs you more to insure, it costs you more to repair, and it costs you more to buy. So we know it's 22% more expensive to buy. And the last thing to feature on is the end bit, right? Is probably the most important thing, is what your car's worth at the end of ownership, right? Because the rest of that almost doesn't matter, right? I know it's a dramatic example. If you bought a Carrera GT 10 years ago and it cost you 300 grand, you spent 300 grand to maintain it, so it owes you 600. The car's worth $1 million now. You're 400 grand better off. That period almost doesn't matter because you're still quids in here, right? So this is almost one of the most important features, because at the end of the day, if your car's taking an absolute hit in depreciation, my God, you can't stomach all of it, right? And EVs have a much higher depreciation curve than anything else, right? So I'm just going to load up this chart here on the screen so that we can go through this together, really. So this is the average depreciation by fuel type over 72 months, right? Now, this was conducted by Motorpoint. They actually took this from Auto Trader themselves, right? So what we can see here, the light blue is obviously EV, petrol's green, diesel's grey or white. We can clearly see here such negative drop of depreciation from an EV. So let's actually look at the 50% point, because that's quite an interesting point to jump straight to. So at the point of a car losing 50% of its value, I would assume, what's that, 38 months? So between 37 to 38 months of ownership, you've lost 50% of an EV. Let's take that for an example then for diesel. Diesel's going to be 52 and petrol's probably going to be 56, 57, right? So there's a big difference there. But the most cataclysmic difference is going to be in the first year to 2 years. You can see how much more aggressive that line of depreciation is, right? So, but most people don't keep a car for more than 3 years, 2-3 years. A lot of people have these cars on finance, I should say. So you got a car on finance, most people change 2 to 3 years on finance as a whole. But look how aggressive that curve is. Now, this is data driven from Auto Trader themselves, right? So this is the market industry leader, right? All of this data is driven from market industry leaders, right? So we can't disagree or disprove this data, right? So my conversation then is, at what point do you stop kidding yourself and having this false illusion that EV ownership will save you money? Because it won't. How can it? Like, it cannot. You cannot look at this and be like, that's the most efficient way going forward, right? It's ludicrous. And the government have pushed this agenda on people, and at the end of the day, the only people that lose out are dealerships like us that have had no success with trying to sell EVs, and the consumers like you. So I will actually add, just in the top left corner here, a video that I did 6 months ago about why we no longer sell EVs as a business. I won't go into it in too much detail now. Basically, we tried 3 different times with multiple different cars to sell at different price points. They just didn't work for us, right? I think maybe location's a big point. If you did a 50-mile circumference around us in Wroughton, outside of Swindon, you just probably meet Bristol or Southampton maybe, or Bath, that have got a clean air zone. Nowhere else around us does, within a very, very sort of, within a 30, 40-mile radius, right? So that obviously has a big influence in terms of buying preference for consumers. But I just feel like the way that we're being forced to think of this narrative is the only solution, when I really don't think it is. Is it part of the solution? Yes, I think EVs are part of the solution. Are they the only answer for everyone to be forced and bottlenecked like chickens into a coop? This is like this is the only solution? No, right? And manufacturers are fighting back. Nissan in Sunderland have fought back. A lot of other businesses have fought back. A lot of companies are looking into hydrogen. A lot of companies are exploring synthetic fuel. Porsche run all their cup cars off fully synthetic fuel. Now, the one thing to note about their synthetic fuel is net carbon neutral, right? It's just really expensive. But as a solution, if you could move to EV, hydrogen, and fully synthetic fuel, I think between all 3, you've got a very sensible platform to work on. To try and suggest EV is the only way forward is ludicrous. I mean, the statistics are we'll run out of lithium before we run out of fossil fuels anyway, right? So, but it feels like we've been made to think this is the solution. We did it with diesels. The government incentivized diesels. You had a lower tax class on a diesel. Now all of a sudden they U-turn years ago and diesels are bad now. And now EVs is sort of going the same way in terms of costs for consumers, right? And the consumer can only stomach so much, right? Yes, you might be able to live with the fact that the depreciation curve is a bit higher if you've got good running costs, or if you don't have to pay too much for your energy, or, but now you've got all the depreciation. You've got to pay to have the luxury of owning an EV car because they cost more new than a comparative ICE engine. And then you have everything else in between: insurance, running costs, maintenance, bills for anything that goes wrong is more expensive, pay per mile. You get to the point where you think, well, why am I being told an EV is the solution? Because it's not a solution to me. I don't want to be coughing up a huge amount of money in negative equity because my car's dropped its bollocks in value and it's cost me a fortune to run and maintain anyway. I'd much rather buy a petrol car. And I think that's what a lot of people are now coming around to realise. The EU aren't reducing the mandate for shits and gigs. They're doing it because there's strategic shift and pattern and problem with forcing everything towards this net zero idea. Look, is net zero a good idea? Of course it is. Any way that you can help reduce your carbon emissions and help reduce your carbon footprint is a good thing, right? Anyone who says anything different, I think it's ludicrous, but there needs to be a sensible conversation to get there. To say we've got 5 years to do it, or 4 and a bit years to do it now, when clearly the market, A, isn't ready for it, and B, the consumer confidence isn't there, you're forcing people to make a decision that will negatively impact them financially in such a large scope when already people are financially struggling anyway. There needs to be a conversation, and I think Yeah, that's just my honest opinion with EVs, and that's based on all the data I can see. That's based on my experiences within the business. I'd love to know your experiences. Have you owned EVs? If you have, would you buy another EV? Would you not buy another EV? Are you looking to buy an EV? If so, what are your considerations for and against buying an EV? I want this to be a bit of an open conversation topic, really, because look, I'm a petrol head first and foremost, but anytime I've made a conscious conversation within the business, I've actually been the more driven factor between me, Craig, and Tim within the business about buying EVs. Because as someone who manages and runs a business with the boys, we have to take our own, we have to take almost our own opinions out of the equation, right? My opinion on something based on my thoughts and feelings are irrelevant, right? Because the only thing that matters is statistics and pragmatic thinking, right? Because that's how you have to run a business, right? We have to make profit, right? So if we try something, it doesn't work, we have to have the conversation to say, look, EVs aren't working for us as a business. They're not financially viable. We have to make a decision to not stop them, which is what we've done, right? And we have actively tried on multiple points. That video will more intricately disclose and describe a bit more of our trials and tribulations within that scope of trying to buy and sell EVs. But yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. Obviously, there's a lot of talk of the EU dropping the mandate, and whether the UK will as well. I know that a lot of other political parties that are looking to eye up moving in after Labour, when I guess at this point really just not to put any political stance on it. I think that's a common consensus. A lot of these mandates are going to be reduced significantly or dropped. I think the only party probably that won't do that is going to be the Green Party. I'm not too sure about the Lib Dems, but I know the Conservatives and Reform and some others are very keen on completely dissolving the net zero mandate at the moment, or at least reducing that. So I know there's a lot of talk about that. But yeah, I'm very interested to know everyone's thoughts and feelings. Jump in the comments. If you have liked the video, please give it a like, comment, and subscribe. And yeah, hope that shed a bit of light and gave you a bit of an informative view from the motor trade point of view to do with EVs. All I would say, though, is actually strange enough to go completely against the grain of what I've just said. I know lots of people within the industry, good friends of mine, that have very successful EV companies that do very well from EVs. So I'm not saying there isn't a business to be had, because I know people that do have a very successful business. We've just not been able to make it work here as a business, and it's not through lack of trying, not through lack of selling cars, because without blowing smoke up our ass, we sell a shed ton of cars a month. We do very well. We have a very financially strong and successful business. So it's not through lack of trying. The market's just not there for us personally. Whether that's location based or something else, I don't know. But I really do think consumer confidence is on the floor at the moment with EVs. But I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments.